I used to think the worst places in America were the ones everybody warned you about: bad neighborhoods, empty parking garages, rest stops after midnight, places where your brain already knows to stay alert. But the place that changed how I look at silence was not like that. It was a small stretch of county road in western Nebraska, about 40 miles from the nearest town with a real grocery store, and maybe 10 miles from a gas station that closed before sunset. There was no dramatic name for it, no local legend printed on a roadside sign, no abandoned asylum sitting on a hill, just flat land, dry grass, old fences, and a motel that looked like it had been built for people who had no other choice but to stop there. That motel was called the Prairie Rest. I know that sounds made up. It sounded made up to me too when I first saw it on the job listing. I had been 26 at the time, broken away that makes you stop caring about pride, and coming off the kind of year that slowly drains you without one big disaster to blame. My mother had passed away the previous winter. My girlfriend had left in March. By summer, I was sleeping on my cousin's couch in Lincoln, applying for anything that offered a bed with the paycheck. The listing was simple: night manager needed, housing included, light maintenance, front desk, laundry, must be comfortable working alone. That last line should have meant something to me. But at that point in my life, being alone sounded like a benefit. The owner's name was Harold Pike. He was in his late 60s, thin, polite, and had the careful voice of a man who never said more than he needed to. We spoke over the phone for less than 10 minutes. He asked if I had a criminal record. I said no. He asked if I drank on the job. I said no. Then he asked something that felt strange. "Do you sleep heavy?" I remember laughing a little because I thought it was a joke. He didn't laugh back, so I said, "Not really." There was a pause. Then he said, "Good. You'll hear the bell if someone comes in." That was it. 2 days later, I drove west with everything I owned in the back of my car. The motel appeared after almost an hour of seeing nothing but fields and power lines. It sat back from the road behind a gravel lot shaped like a crooked letter L, with 12 rooms on the long side and 5 more along the short side facing an old maintenance shed. The sign out front had a faded red vacancy light, though I would learn pretty quickly it stayed on whether we had rooms or not. Behind the property, the land dropped into a shallow ditch, then opened into miles of pasture. There were no nearby houses, no gas station lights, no traffic sound except the occasional truck moving somewhere far away. Harold was waiting in the office when I arrived. He handed me a ring of keys, showed me the breaker box, the laundry room, the linen shelves, and the small apartment behind the front desk where I would be sleeping. It was really just a converted storage room: a bed, a sink, a hot plate, one small window facing the back lot. I remember thinking it was depressing, but not unbearable. I had lived in worse places. Before he left, Harold walked me through the guest register. Everything was still done on paper. Cash was common. IDs were checked, but not always copied. Most guests were truckers, harvest workers, hunters, or people passing through after missing the last motel off the interstate. Then he pointed to the far end of the property, room 17. It sat alone on the short side of the L closest to the shed, with its door facing away from the road. The paint around the number had peeled badly, and the outside bulb above it was darker than the others. Harold tapped the desk with one finger and said, "Don't rent that one unless everything else is full." I asked if something was wrong with it. He said the plumbing was unreliable. That was all. Not broken, not under repair, just unreliable. I nodded because I didn't care enough to ask more. When you're new somewhere, you try not to seem difficult. That first week was boring in a way I almost enjoyed. I checked in maybe 3 or 4 people a night. Most wanted a bed, a shower, and no conversation. I learned which floorboards creaked in the office. I learned that the ice machine made a low grinding sound every 40 minutes. I learned that coyotes sounded much closer than they actually were, or at least that's what I told myself. The nights had a rhythm. Around 9, the last daylight disappeared from the fields. Around 10, the road went quiet. Around midnight, the motel seemed to settle deeper into itself. After that, every sound became separate: a pipe ticking behind the wall, wind moving under a door, a hanger tapping inside an empty room. I know people say silence can be loud, but out there it felt more specific than that. It felt like the silence was listening before deciding what noise to make next. Still, nothing truly strange happened at first. And while you're listening, if you're enjoying these stories and don't want to miss future horror uploads from Fear Aloud Files, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. We upload new disturbing stories every week. Not until my eighth night. It was a little after 1 o'clock in the morning when the bell above the office door rang. I'd been sitting behind the desk with an old paperback open in front of me, not really reading it. A man stepped in wearing a brown canvas jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked maybe 45, average height, clean shaven, tired, but not drunk. He had no luggage with him, just a folded paper in one hand. He asked for a room at the far end. Not a room at the far end. That wording made me look up. I told him we had plenty much available and offered him room 12, which was at the end of the long side. He shook his head once. No, he said. The other end. I looked through the front window toward the dark side of the building. Room 17. I told him that room had plumbing issues. He didn't seem surprised. He only unfolded the paper and slid it across the counter. It was a $20 bill wrapped around two tens. $40 cash. Our rate was $62. I told him it wasn't enough. He said, Harold lets me stay there. I should have called Harold. That was what I should have done. But it was late, and the man said it with such calm certainty that I felt like the unreasonable one for questioning it. I asked for his ID. He placed it on the counter, Nebraska license. Name was Daniel Voss. The address was from a town I didn't recognize. I wrote it down in the register. When I asked how many nights, he said, just until morning. Then he asked something that made my hand pause over the page. Is the back window still painted shut? I looked at him. He stared back patient, like he had asked whether the TV worked. I said I didn't know. He gave a small nod. Good, he said. I remember the word because it didn't answer anything. I gave him the key. Room 17. He took it without touching my hand. Then he stepped outside and walked across the gravel lot toward the far side of the motel. I watched him through the office window. He didn't turn on a flashlight, didn't check his phone, didn't look at the room numbers. He walked directly to room 17 like he had done it many times before. The strange part came when he reached the door. He didn't unlock it right away. He stood there with his head slightly turned toward the maintenance shed. Not looking at it exactly, more like listening to it. Then he unlocked the room and went inside. The bulb above his door flickered once, then went dark again. I sat at the desk for a while after that, staring at the register. Daniel Voss, room 17 cash, no vehicle listed. That was when I realized I hadn't seen a car come in. No headlights, no engine. No tires on gravel, just the bell over the door and then him standing in the office. I went outside a few minutes later and walked the lot with my hands in my jacket pockets. There were 6 vehicles parked in front of occupied rooms: a pickup near room 3, a white van near room 5, 2 semis along the road shoulder, a sedan by room 10, my car behind the office. Nothing near room 17, nothing by the shed, no car idling out on the road. The county road was empty in both directions, and out there, with the motel lights buzzing behind me and the fields stretching black beyond the ditch, I had the first real feeling that something about the prairie rest had rules I didn't know yet. I went back inside and locked the office door. For the next hour, nothing happened. Then at 2:17 in the morning, the phone on the front desk rang. Not my cell, the motel landline. It was an old beige phone with a cracked plastic receiver, the kind that made every ring sound sharper than it should. I picked it up before the second ring finished. Prairie Rest, I said. For a moment, there was only static. Then a woman's voice came through, low and close. Don't let him open the window. I didn't answer right away. The line crackled. I asked, Who is this? The woman breathed once into the receiver, not heavily, not dramatically, just close enough that I could hear the small, wet sound of air catching in her throat. Then she said, He always forgets by 3. The call disconnected. I kept the phone pressed to my ear for several seconds after the dial tone started, because my mind was still trying to turn those words into something normal. A prank, a wrong number, a local drunk. Someone who knew Harold and knew room 17 had a painted shut window. But there was one problem with that. I had never told anyone Daniel was in room 17, and the phone rang again before I could put the receiver down. The sudden sound made me flinch hard enough that I almost dropped it. For a second, I just stared at the base. Then I picked up. Prairie Rest. Silence. Not static this time, just silence. The kind that makes you wonder whether the connection actually exists. I waited. Nothing. A few seconds passed. Then I heard what sounded like movement, very faint, like fabric rubbing against fabric. Someone standing near a phone, listening, not speaking. I felt irritation replacing some of the confusion. Hello? The movement stopped. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the receiver back into place. The office suddenly felt smaller. The fluorescent light above the counter buzzed softly. The clock on the wall read 2:18 a.m. Outside, the gravel lot sat completely empty beneath the security lights. I told myself not to overthink it. Small towns had strange people. Remote places attracted lonely people. Maybe somebody knew the motel. Maybe somebody enjoyed making late-night calls. There were dozens of reasonable explanations. The problem was that my brain kept returning to the same detail. Don't let him open the window, not a room, not a door, not leave the motel. The window, specifically the window. The same window the man had asked about, the painted shut window. I opened the register again. Daniel Voss. The ink still looked fresh. I stared at the entry for several seconds, then I looked toward the dark office window. Room 17 wasn't directly visible from the front desk. The building corner blocked most of it. If I wanted to see whether the light was on, I'd have to step outside. I honestly don't know why I decided to do that. Curiosity, probably. Maybe boredom. Maybe because once somebody plants an idea in your head, it's difficult not to keep looking at it. Either way, I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The air felt colder than before. A steady wind moved across the fields, not strong, just enough to keep the grass whispering. I walked slowly along the front of the motel. Most rooms were dark. A television glowed behind room 6's curtains. Room 10 had a bathroom light on. Everything else looked asleep. When I rounded the corner and looked toward room 17, I stopped. The light was on, not unusual by itself. The strange thing was the curtain. It wasn't fully closed. A narrow gap ran down the center, maybe 2 inches wide, just enough to see part of the room. I stood there debating whether I should get closer. Then movement appeared behind the glass. Daniel. At least I assumed it was Daniel. The figure crossed the room slowly, not walking normally, more pacing. Back and forth, back and forth. The room itself seemed mostly empty. A bed, a lamp, the dresser, nothing unusual. Then the figure stopped, completely stopped, and remained motionless, facing the rear wall, the wall where the window would be, the painted shut window. I waited. The figure didn't move, didn't sit down, didn't lie on the bed, just stood there, looking toward the back of the room. Minutes passed. I know because I checked my watch twice. Still nothing. Then the lamp suddenly switched off. The room went dark. The silhouette vanished. I stood there another few moments before realizing how ridiculous I probably looked. A motel clerk spying on a paying guest at 2:30 in the morning. So I headed back toward the office. Halfway there, I heard something. A metallic sound. Very faint. Somewhere behind me. I turned immediately. Nothing moved. The lot remained empty. The rooms remained dark. The wind continued drifting across the fields, then I heard it again. Clink. Like metal touching metal. Not from room 17, from behind room 17, near the maintenance shed. I stared into the darkness. The shed sat maybe 50 yards beyond the room. Old wooden structure, corrugated roof. One security light mounted above the side entrance. The bulb hadn't worked since my second day there. At least I assumed it hadn't. I'd never seen it on. Now the entire area behind room 17 was swallowed by darkness. I listened. Nothing. For nearly 30 seconds, everything remained silent. Then came another sound. This time I knew exactly what it was. A chain, moving, not violently, not being dragged, just shifting, as though somebody had touched it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up immediately. The shed doors were secured by a chain and padlock. Harold had shown them to me during orientation. Mostly old equipment inside, broken furniture, unused supplies. Nothing important. No reason for anyone to be there at this hour. I found myself staring at that darkness much longer than I should have, trying to see movement, trying to catch another sound. Instead, I noticed something else. A light, far beyond the shed. At first, I thought it was a vehicle, but it wasn't moving. It sat motionless in the distance, small, white, almost like a flashlight. Yet it seemed too high off the ground and too far away. I squinted. The light remained steady, then slowly disappeared, not switched off. Hidden, like something had stepped in front of it. I felt a strange tightening in my stomach, the kind that arrives before your brain has figured out why you're uncomfortable. I started walking back toward the office, faster this time. The motel suddenly felt much more isolated than it had an hour earlier. By the time I reached the front door, I found myself looking over my shoulder every few seconds. Not because I thought someone was chasing me, because I couldn't shake the feeling that something behind room 17 was paying attention. I locked the office door, checked it twice, then sat behind the counter. The clock now read 2:41 a.m. I told myself I was being stupid. Everything had explanations. Everything. The phone calls, the guests, the shed, the chain, the distant light. Normal things could look strange at night, especially when you were tired, especially when you were alone. I kept repeating that thought. It helped for almost 15 minutes. Then the bell above the office door rang, and when I looked up, nobody was standing there. The door hadn't opened. Yet the bell was still swaying slightly, as if someone had just walked through it. And before I could stand up, 3 slow knocks came from the back wall of my apartment, directly on the other side of the wall, the side facing the fields. Directly on the other side of the wall, the side facing the fields. I froze. The knocks weren't loud. They didn't sound aggressive. That was almost worse. 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. I sat completely still behind the desk, my eyes fixed on the hallway leading toward my apartment, waiting, listening. The motel suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. No television noise, no distant truck, not even the wind, just the buzzing fluorescent light overhead. I looked at the clock, 2:57 a.m. Another minute passed, nothing. Then the knocks came again. Exactly 3, same rhythm, same location. The wall behind my bed, the outside wall, the one facing open pasture. My apartment didn't back onto another room. There wasn't a hallway behind it, no maintenance area, nothing. Just grass, a fence line, and miles of darkness. I stood up slowly, my chair wheels squeaked against the floor. The sound seemed absurdly loud. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, locking the office, waiting until sunrise. But curiosity has always been one of my worst qualities. It gets mistaken for bravery sometimes. It isn't. Most of the time, it's just an inability to leave questions unanswered. I grabbed the large flashlight Harold kept beneath the desk. It was heavy enough to double as a weapon. Then I unlocked the office door and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since midnight. The lot remained empty. Every vehicle was exactly where I'd seen it earlier. No new arrivals, no movement. I walked around the side of the building toward the back. My flashlight beam swept across the ground. Dry grass, old tire tracks, discarded soda can. Nothing unusual. The rear wall of my apartment came into view. The window sat about 4 feet above the ground. The blinds inside were closed. Everything looked normal. I moved closer, examining the siding. No footprints, no damage, no rocks, no branches, nothing that could explain the sound. Then I noticed something. At first, I thought it was a stain, a dark mark near the base of the wall. I lowered the flashlight. The mark stretched along the siding for several feet, thin, uneven, almost like something had been dragged through dirt before brushing against the building. I crouched down. The soil beneath it looked disturbed, freshly disturbed, as if something heavy had recently crossed the area. I followed the marks with my flashlight. They led away from the wall, across the grass, toward the rear of the property, toward room 17. I straightened immediately. A pulse of unease moved through me. The track wasn't obvious enough to prove anything. It could have been made days earlier, maybe weeks. But under the beam, it looked fresh, fresh enough that I found myself following it, step by step. The motel sat silent behind me. The farther I walked, the more isolated everything felt. Soon the glow from the office windows seemed much farther away than it actually was. The track continued across the grass, past the corner of room 17, toward the maintenance shed. My flashlight found the chain on the shed doors. It hung exactly where it should. Padlock secured, doors closed, no sign anyone had entered. I exhaled slowly. Maybe I'd imagined the sound, maybe clink. The noise came from inside. I stopped moving. The sound wasn't loud, just metal touching metal, somewhere within the shed. Then silence. I stood there staring at the doors, trying to convince myself I'd heard something else. The wind, a loose tool, an animal. But my stomach already knew I wasn't convinced. I approached slowly. The beam illuminated the chain, the rusted hinges, the cracked wood. Everything looked undisturbed. Then I noticed the lock. It was secured, but not properly. The shackle wasn't fully closed. It had been pushed through the chain, enough to appear locked, not enough to actually secure anything. I stared at it. Harold had definitely locked it during my first week. I remembered because he'd complained about kids sneaking inside years earlier. The realization made my mouth go dry. Someone had opened the shed recently, very recently. The chain shifted slightly in the wind. For several seconds, I debated whether to open it. Part of me knew I should leave it alone. Wait until morning. Call Harold. The smarter part of my brain was losing the argument. I removed the lock. The chain slid free with a metallic rattle. The sound seemed much louder than it should have. I pulled one door open. The hinges groaned. Dust swirled through the flashlight beam. The interior smelled like old wood and machine oil. Rows of shelves lined the walls, broken chairs, boxes, paint cans, a rusted lawnmower, nothing surprising, nothing threatening. I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my boots. My flashlight moved slowly across the room, every corner, every shelf, every shadow. Nobody, no animal, no sign of recent activity. Then the beam reached the far wall and stopped. A chair sat facing the wall, not unusual by itself. The unusual part was what hung above it, a map, large, yellowed with age. Pinned directly onto the wood, I moved closer. County roads, property boundaries, old survey markings, the area around the motel. At first it seemed harmless, then I noticed the circles, dozens of them, drawn in red marker. Some were small, some large, scattered across the map. Certain locations had dates written beside them. Most of the dates were old, years old. A few were more recent. I leaned closer. One date caught my eye immediately, because it was from only 3 weeks earlier, and beside it was a location I recognized. The Prairie Rest Motel, my motel. Directly over the motel location was a red circle, and beneath it, written in careful handwriting, were 3 words. He came back. I stared at the writing, trying to understand what I was looking at. Then my flashlight moved slightly lower and revealed a second line beneath it. A line I hadn't seen at first. One added much more recently. The ink looked darker, newer. The words read, Room 17 again. And before I could process that, something shifted behind me, very quietly, like someone taking a single careful step across the shed floor. Every muscle in my body locked instantly. The flashlight remained pointed at the map, I didn't turn around, not immediately. For one strange second, my brain tried to convince me the sound hadn't happened. Old buildings make noise, wood shifts, temperature changes. I knew all the usual explanations. The problem was that this hadn't sounded like wood. It sounded like weight, a footstep, deliberate, measured, close. I slowly turned. The flashlight beam swept across the shed. Shelves, boxes, tools, empty floor, nothing, nobody. The room looked exactly as it had 30 seconds earlier. I stood completely still, listening. The silence returned. Then I heard breathing, very faint. My heart immediately started hammering. I moved the flashlight again, left, right, corners, behind shelves. Nothing. The breathing continued, slow, steady. Then I realized it wasn't coming from the shed. It was me. I hadn't noticed how hard I was breathing. The realization almost made me laugh. Almost. Then the flashlight beam landed on the floor near the entrance, and the laugh died instantly. There were footprints, not dusty footprints, fresh footprints. The dirt tracked across the floor was darker than the surrounding dust. Whoever made them hadn't been here days ago or weeks ago. They had been here recently, very recently. I followed the trail with the beam. The footprints entered through the front doors, crossed the room, stopped directly in front of the map, the exact spot where I was standing now. Then they continued toward the rear wall, toward a stack of old shelving units. I walked closer. The footprints disappeared beneath them. The shelves were pushed against the wall. At least they looked that way. Until I noticed the gap. A narrow opening between two units, maybe 2 feet wide, just enough space for someone to squeeze through. I felt a sudden wave of hesitation. Every instinct told me to leave. Lock the shed, call Harold, pretend I had never found any of this. Instead, I stepped forward. The flashlight beam entered the gap. At first, I only saw darkness, then wood. Then another room, a hidden room. My stomach tightened immediately. The space couldn't have been more than 10 feet by 10 feet. No windows. Concrete floor. One bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light was off. A small table sat in the center. 3 folding chairs around it. Nothing else, no decorations, no tools, no equipment, just a room. A room that absolutely shouldn't have existed inside a maintenance shed. I stepped inside. The air felt colder. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The flashlight crossed the table. Several notebooks sat neatly stacked on top. Beside them was a coffee mug. The liquid inside had dried long ago. Dust covered everything, except the top notebook. The top notebook looked cleaner than the others, recently handled. I picked it up. The cover was black. No label. No title. I opened it. The handwriting matched the map. Careful, neat, almost obsessive. The first few pages contained dates, weather conditions, vehicle descriptions, room numbers, guest names, dozens of them. Maybe hundreds, years' worth of entries. I flipped further. Most entries followed the same pattern. Name, arrival time, room assignment, departure, nothing unusual. Until one entry caught my eye because the room number was 17. October 14th, guest, Daniel Voss. Room 17 stayed until sunrise, window remained closed. I frowned, then kept reading. November 2nd, Daniel Voss. Room 17 stayed until sunrise, window remained closed. November 29th, Daniel Voss. Room 17 stayed until sunrise, window remained closed. December 21st, Daniel Voss. Room 17 stayed until sunrise. Window remained closed. I stopped turning pages. My mouth had gone dry. The entries stretched back years. Not months. Years, always the same name, always room 17. Always the same final note. Window remained closed. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Because no normal guest visits a forgotten roadside motel for years without anyone mentioning it. And no motel owner keeps records like this. Not unless the guest matters, or the window matters, or both. I flipped ahead. More entries, more names. Most appeared only once. Some appeared twice. A A few had notes written beside them: left early, never returned, asked questions. Then, about halfway through the notebook, I found a page folded inward. Someone had marked it intentionally. I unfolded it. The handwriting immediately looked different, less controlled, more hurried. The date was 12 years old, and the entry was much longer than the others. The first sentence read, "If you're reading this, Harold either left or he's dead." A chill moved through me. I sat down in one of the folding chairs, the flashlight resting across my lap. The hidden room suddenly felt much smaller. I continued reading. The writer never gave his name, only details. He had worked nights at the motel, just like me. He had found the room behind the shed, just like me. And according to him, every strange thing at the Prairie Rest centered around one place: Room 17. The entry described years of unexplained incidents, guests hearing voices, phone calls from disconnected numbers, knocking outside windows, people reporting someone standing in the fields. Most of it sounded like the kind of stories bored workers invent. Until I reached the final paragraph, the handwriting became shaky there, uneven, like the writer had been afraid. The final lines said, "Daniel isn't the problem." I stared at the sentence, then read the next one. "The problem is what waits outside the window." My heart skipped. The notebook suddenly felt heavier. The room felt colder. I turned the page and discovered someone had torn out every page that followed. Every single one. Only jagged paper edges remained. The rest was gone, removed deliberately. I sat there for several seconds, trying to decide whether I felt disappointed or relieved. Then I heard a sound outside, not from the shed, not from the motel, from the fields, a long distance away. At first, I thought it was a coyote. Then it came again, and I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human voice. Faint, almost impossible to hear, calling something across the darkness. And whatever it was saying sounded very close to my name. I didn't move. For a second, I honestly wondered if I had imagined it. The voice had been so faint that my brain could have filled in the rest. That happens sometimes, especially when you're tired, especially at 3 in the morning. You hear something incomplete and your mind turns it into something familiar. I sat perfectly still in the folding chair, listening. The hidden room felt silent again. The flashlight rested across my knees. The notebook remained open in my hands. Then the voice came again, far away, carried by the wind. This time I couldn't make out the words, only the tone: human. Definitely human. A single voice calling across a great distance. The sound lasted only a second before disappearing. I slowly stood. Every instinct told me to stay inside the shed. Instead, I switched off the flashlight. The room immediately went black. For several seconds, I couldn't see anything. Then faint moonlight, leaking through gaps in the shed walls, began outlining shapes. I moved toward the entrance, carefully, quietly. Something about the voice had changed the atmosphere entirely. Until then, everything had felt strange. Now it felt personal. I slipped out of the hidden room and crossed the main shed. The front doors remained partially open from when I'd entered. Cold air drifted inside. I stepped through the gap and looked toward the fields. Darkness, endless darkness. The motel sat behind me. Room 17 stood off to my right. The curtain remained partially open, a thin stripe of yellow light still visible through the window. Everything appeared normal. The voice came again. My entire body stiffened. This time I heard the word clearly. "Matthew?" My name, not shouted, not whispered, called. The way somebody might call to a friend from down a hallway, a calm voice, patient, expecting an answer. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nobody out here should know my name. I had arrived only 8 days earlier. I barely knew anyone within 50 miles. The sound had come from somewhere beyond the pasture, far beyond, far enough that no normal conversation should have been possible. Yet the voice had sounded clear, almost intimate. I immediately turned toward the motel office. The urge to get indoors suddenly outweighed every other thought. I started walking, fast. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. I avoided looking toward the fields. I don't know why. Maybe because part of me expected to see somebody standing there, watching, waiting. Halfway across the lot, I noticed movement. My eyes snapped toward room 17. The curtain gap was wider now, much wider, wide enough for me to see nearly half the room. The bed, the dresser, the lamp, and Daniel. He stood beside the rear wall, exactly where I'd seen him earlier, facing the back window, completely motionless. I stopped walking. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 40 yards. The room was bright enough for me to see his profile. His expression looked tense, focused, almost frightened. Then he raised one hand, slowly, carefully, toward the window. My heart immediately began pounding. The phone call, the woman, don't let him open the window. The words came back instantly. I didn't understand why. I still had no idea what was happening. But every part of me suddenly felt certain of one thing. If Daniel opened that window, something bad would happen, something very bad. I started toward the room, at first walking, then faster. The gravel lot seemed much larger than before. Every second felt slow. Daniel's hand reached the frame. The curtain moved slightly. I broke into a jog. Hey! My voice sounded weak in the open night. Daniel didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me. He kept staring at the window, his fingers touching the frame. I reached the walkway outside room 15, still 20 yards away. Daniel! Nothing. Then something happened that stopped me completely. A second hand appeared on the other side of the glass. Not inside the room. Outside, pressed against the rear window. I froze. The hand looked pale, too pale. The fingers long and thin, almost gray in the moonlight. For one impossible second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Because the window faced open pasture. Nothing else. No building, no porch, no structure. Just empty land. Yet somebody or something was standing outside that window. I couldn't see the body, only the hand, pressed flat against the glass. Daniel immediately stepped backward. The fear on his face became obvious, even from a distance. He stumbled once, then caught himself. The hand remained motionless, waiting. The curtain shifted, and another hand appeared beside the first. I felt a surge of panic unlike anything I'd experienced before. Not because of what I was seeing, because of how wrong it felt, the proportions, the stillness, the way those hands simply remained there, as if they had been waiting for Daniel to notice them. Then every light inside room 17 went out instantly. The room vanished into darkness. I stopped breathing. The entire motel seemed to go silent. No buzzing lights, no wind, no distant highway noise, nothing. For several seconds, room 17 remained completely black. Then a single scream exploded from inside. Daniel. No question. A raw, terrified scream, the kind that comes from somebody who has just seen something they cannot understand. I ran, not toward the office, not away, toward room 17. The scream cut off abruptly. The darkness remained. And as I reached the gravel path leading to the room, I noticed the door slowly beginning to open by itself. From the inside, just a few inches, then a little more, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. And standing in the doorway was a silhouette that definitely wasn't Daniel. I stopped so abruptly that my shoes slid across the gravel. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The figure wasn't moving, wasn't rushing toward me, wasn't doing anything dramatic. It simply stood there, motionless, filling the doorway. The darkness behind it somehow looked deeper than the darkness around it. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's exactly how it felt. The motel lights illuminated part of the walkway, part of the wall, part of the doorframe. Yet the darkness inside room 17 seemed untouched by any of it, like the light stopped at the threshold. I stared. The figure stared back. At least I assumed it was looking at me. I couldn't see eyes, couldn't see a face, just a shape, tall, thin, human enough to be recognizable, wrong enough to make every instinct scream at me to leave. Then the office phone began ringing. The sound exploded across the property, loud, sharp, completely unexpected. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The figure didn't react. The ringing continued. One ring, two, three. The motel suddenly felt suspended between two separate moments. The phone ringing behind me, the doorway ahead of me, neither changing, neither making sense. Then the figure took a single step backward, not toward me, away from me, retreating into the room. The darkness swallowed it immediately. Gone, just like that. I stood frozen another second, then I ran, not toward the room, toward the office. I wish I could tell you I charged into room 17 like some horror movie hero. I didn't. Nobody would. Not after what I'd just seen. The phone was still ringing when I burst through the office door. I grabbed the receiver. Hello? Silence. My breathing sounded deafening. Then the same woman's voice returned. The exact same voice from earlier, calm, low, close to the receiver. Did he open it? My throat felt dry. What is room 17? The woman ignored the question. Did he open the window? I looked toward the office window. Room 17 wasn't visible from here. I don't know. For the first time, emotion entered her voice, not fear, frustration, the kind somebody feels when watching a predictable mistake happen again. You need to know. The line crackled. I gripped the receiver tighter. Who are you? No answer. Instead, she asked something else. Has Harold told you about the records? My stomach tightened instantly. The notebooks, the map, the hidden room, I hadn't mentioned any of that. How do you know about those? Silence. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Because I wrote some of them. I stopped breathing. The woman continued. Listen carefully. The line crackled again. For a moment, I thought the call would disconnect. Instead, her voice returned, lower now, almost exhausted. Daniel always comes back. I glanced toward the door, the dark motel beyond, the empty lot, the room sitting at the far end of the property. What does that mean? He thinks he can fix it. What? No response. Only a long pause, then, he never remembers how it ends. A chill ran through me. The wording felt familiar. Suddenly, I remembered the first call. He always forgets by 3, the exact phrase. I looked at the clock, 3:08 a.m. The woman spoke again. Matthew! Hearing my name from her somehow felt even worse than hearing it from the field. You need to leave the office. Why? Because he's already inside. My stomach dropped. What? The line went dead immediately. No warning, no click, nothing. Just silence. I lowered the receiver slowly. Then I heard movement from the hallway behind me, the hallway leading toward my apartment. Every muscle in my body locked. The office suddenly felt much too small. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. The clock ticked. And somewhere beyond the doorway leading to my room, something shifted. A soft scrape, like a shoe against the floor. I stared at the dark hallway, waiting. Another sound followed, a slow footstep, then another, approaching. Not running, not sneaking, walking, calmly, deliberately toward the office. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my neck. I backed away from the hallway, one step, then another. The front door sat only a few feet behind me. The hallway remained dark. Then a shadow appeared, not a person, not fully, just part of one. A shoulder, the side of a head, standing just beyond the corner, watching. I couldn't see a face, but I knew something was there. And then, from outside the office window, another figure walked past. I turned instantly. A man, crossing the gravel lot, heading toward room 17. The motel lights illuminated him clearly. Brown canvas jacket, baseball cap, average height. Daniel. I looked back toward the hallway, then back outside. My brain struggled to catch up, because if Daniel was outside, walking toward room 17, then who or what was standing inside my apartment hallway? And before I could move, the shadow around the corner slowly leaned farther into view, revealing a face I immediately recognized. Because it was Daniel, exactly the same Daniel I had just seen outside. I couldn't move. For a second, it felt like my brain had simply stopped processing information. The Daniel outside continued walking across the gravel lot. The Daniel in the hallway remained motionless. Both existed at the same time, both looked identical, same jacket, same cap, same face. The fluorescent light above me flickered once. The shadow in the hallway leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, almost curiously, like it was studying my reaction. I stumbled backward. The front door hit my shoulder. My hand found the handle. The hallway Daniel smiled. Not a normal smile, not exaggerated, not monstrous, just slightly wrong, a little too slow, a little too deliberate. The kind of smile you would expect from somebody pretending to understand how people smile. Then the office lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I immediately pushed through the front door. Cold air hit my face. I nearly fell down the front steps. The motel lot stretched around me beneath the security lights. The office behind me remained dark. Every other room still had power, only the office had gone black. I turned toward room 17. Daniel was no longer walking. He stood outside the room, frozen, staring toward the rear field, toward the back window, the same direction he had been staring all night. Then he shouted, not at me, not at the motel, toward the darkness behind the property. "Leave me alone." The words echoed across the fields. Silence answered. Then another voice replied, his voice, the exact same voice, from somewhere out in the darkness. "Leave me alone." The same words, the same tone, repeated back. My stomach turned. Daniel heard it too. I could tell immediately. His posture changed. His shoulders stiffened. Then the voice came again. Closer this time, still hidden in the darkness, repeating him perfectly. Every word, every inflection, every breath, like an echo. Except echoes don't answer several seconds later, and they don't come from empty fields. Daniel backed away from room 17, slowly, terrified. I started toward him, partly because I wanted answers, partly because being near another human suddenly felt very important. "Daniel!" He looked at me. For the first time all night, he genuinely seemed to see me. The fear on his face looked real. Not confusion, not panic, recognition, like he knew exactly what was happening and exactly how bad it was. "Get in your car." His voice shook. "What?" "Get in your car and drive." The voice from the field answered immediately. "Get in your car and drive." Perfect, identical. A chill moved through my entire body. Daniel closed his eyes, just for a second, like somebody hearing bad news they already expected. Then he looked back toward me and said something that made everything worse. "It's learning faster." The voice repeated him, almost instantly. "It's learning faster." Not 3 seconds later, not two. Almost immediately, the distance between the original voice and the copy was shrinking. Daniel seemed to realize the same thing. His face lost what little color remained. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded photograph, and shoved it towards me. "Take it." I grabbed it automatically. Before I could ask anything, he backed away, toward room 17. Not away from it, toward it. "Daniel, what are you doing?" He ignored me. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the motel, the darkness beyond the back window. The voice didn't repeat me this time. Only him. Only Daniel, as if it was interested in him specifically. Then I looked at the photograph. The image was old, at least 10 years old, maybe older. 3 people stood in front of the Prairie Rest, a younger Harold, a woman I didn't recognize, and Daniel. Except the photograph couldn't be 10 years old, because Daniel looked exactly the same, not younger, not older, exactly the same. Same face, same hair, same jacket. My hand started shaking. I turned the photo over. A date was written on the back, April 2009, 17 years earlier. I looked up. Daniel was still standing there. Exactly the same man from the picture, exactly the same age, exactly the same appearance, as though 17 years had never happened. Then a new voice came from the darkness, not Daniel's voice, not the woman's, a third voice, male, old, weak, and heartbreakingly familiar, because I recognized it immediately. Harold, the motel owner. The voice drifted across the field, thin and distant. Don't let him open it. The exact warning the woman had given. Daniel heard it too. His eyes widened, then something moved in the field, far beyond the fence line. At first, I thought it was a person. Then I realized it was much too tall. The shape stood motionless in the darkness, watching the motel, watching room 17, watching Daniel. And as it took its first slow step toward the property, Daniel whispered something so quietly, I almost didn't hear it. He found us again. And for the first time, I realized Daniel wasn't coming back to room 17 because he was trapped there. He was coming back because he was trying to keep whatever was in those fields from getting out. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The figure in the distance remained motionless, too tall, far too tall. The farther I looked at it, the harder it became to judge its size. Part of me thought it might be a person. Another part thought it was much larger than that. The darkness around it seemed distorted somehow, like my eyes couldn't focus properly. Daniel took a slow step backward, toward room 17. The thing in the field immediately took another step forward. The movement happened at the exact same time. I felt a chill crawl through my body, almost like the two actions were connected. Then Daniel looked directly at me. How long have you worked here? 8 days. His face tightened. Then you still have time. The statement didn't comfort me. It sounded like a deadline. The figure in the field moved again, closer now, still hundreds of yards away, yet noticeably closer. The motel lights should have illuminated more of it. Instead, they seemed to reveal less. Its outline kept changing, tall, thin, then wider, then thin again, like my eyes couldn't decide what they were seeing. Daniel suddenly grabbed my shoulder, hard. You need to listen carefully. The fear in his voice was real, raw, the kind that comes from experience rather than panic. I've tried leaving. My stomach tightened. What? I've left hundreds of times. The words sounded absurd, but after everything I'd seen, absurd wasn't enough to dismiss them. Daniel continued staring toward the approaching figure. Every few months, I remember enough to come back. The thing in the field took another step. Closer? Remember what? His jaw clenched. I don't know. That answer somehow felt worse. I remember pieces. Another step, closer. I remember running. Another step. I remember Harold. Another. I remember the window. Then he looked directly at me. And every time I remember the same thing. The field suddenly seemed much quieter. Even the wind had stopped. Daniel swallowed, then spoke. Never let it inside. A loud crash exploded from behind us. Both of us spun around. Room 17. The back window had shattered. The sound echoed across the property. Glass scattered inside the room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Daniel's face lost all color. No. The word barely escaped his mouth. The thing in the field stopped walking. Completely stopped, as if it had been waiting for exactly that. The broken window sat exposed to the darkness beyond the motel. A cold wind rushed through the opening, not from the direction the wind had been blowing earlier, the opposite direction, toward the room, toward the motel, toward us. The temperature seemed to drop instantly. My breath became visible. Daniel looked genuinely terrified now, not frightened, terrified. The kind of fear that strips away every attempt to stay calm. Then every light in the motel went out, every room, every sign, every lamp. Darkness swallowed the property, only moonlight remained. And for the first time, I heard movement coming from all across the field. Not one thing, many things. Footsteps, dozens of them, slow, approaching, from every direction. The sound seemed impossible. The pasture had been empty. I'd seen it myself. Yet now something was moving through it. A lot of somethings. Daniel grabbed my arm. Office. We ran. The gravel crunched beneath our feet. The footsteps continued behind us. Steady, unhurried. The office door slammed shut behind us. Daniel immediately locked it, then pushed a filing cabinet against it, then another, as though he'd done this before, many times before. The darkness outside pressed against the windows. I stood there breathing hard, trying to understand what was happening. Daniel didn't look at me. He looked at the clock, the old battery-powered clock above the desk, the one thing still running. The hands read 3:33 a.m. Daniel closed his eyes. For a moment, he looked exhausted, defeated. Then he whispered something, not to me, to himself. No wonder I forgot. My heart pounded. What does that mean? He slowly opened his eyes. The answer came in a voice barely above a whisper. Because this isn't the first time you've been here. The room suddenly felt colder. I stared at him. What? Daniel looked at me with genuine pity, the kind somebody gives a person receiving terrible news. Then he pointed toward the wall behind the front desk, toward the guest register, toward tonight's entries. Matthew. His voice sounded tired. Check the book. I walked over slowly, my hands shaking. The register still lay open where I'd left it. I found tonight's page, found Daniel's entry, room 17. Then my eyes moved lower, and my entire body went numb. Because beneath Daniel's name was another entry, written in my own handwriting, dated 3 months earlier. Guest name, Matthew Carter, room assigned, 17. And beside it, in handwriting I didn't remember writing, were 4 words. He opened the window. I stared at the page. The words didn't make sense. Not because they were impossible, because they felt familiar. My eyes remained fixed on the handwriting, my handwriting. Every letter looked exactly right, every curve, every stroke. No hesitation, no sign of forgery. I knew immediately that I had written it. The problem was that I had absolutely no memory of doing so. A strange pressure began building behind my eyes. Daniel was saying something. I could hear his voice, but it sounded distant, muted, like I was listening through water. The page blurred slightly, then something happened. Not a vision, not exactly, more like a memory slipping loose. A fragment, a moment. I saw myself standing in room 17. The same room, the same lamp, the same back wall, the same window. I remembered touching the frame, remembered feeling curious, remembered hearing a voice outside calling my name. Then the memory vanished. I grabbed the counter to steady myself. Daniel didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked relieved. You remember something. It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard. What is this place? For several seconds, he didn't answer. Outside, the footsteps continued, dozens of them moving slowly around the motel. The sound reminded me of people walking through dry grass, patient, methodical, waiting. Finally, Daniel spoke. Harold found it in the 70s. The words came quietly. Found what? The window. My stomach tightened. Daniel looked toward the darkness outside. He said it wasn't built here. Another memory flashed through my head. Harold, younger, standing beside room 17, arguing with somebody, a woman, the same woman from the photograph. The memory vanished before I could hear the conversation. Daniel continued. The room was normal once. Another footstep outside, closer. The window wasn't. The office walls suddenly creaked, a slow pressure, as if something outside had leaned against the building. Neither of us moved. Daniel's eyes remained on the door. When people opened it, he stopped, then shook his head. No. The expression on his face changed. Fear. Real fear. That's the problem. What is, His answer came immediately. You can't remember. Something hit the outside wall, hard. The entire office shook. The filing cabinet rattled, glass vibrated. Then silence returned. Daniel looked at the clock, 3:36 a.m. His face darkened. We don't have much time. Another memory surfaced, stronger this time. The hidden room, the notebooks. Harold speaking directly to me, not tonight, months ago. Write everything down. The memory disappeared, my pulse accelerated. Months ago, not tonight, months ago. I looked at the register again, 3 months earlier, my name, room 17. The realization struck me so suddenly that I nearly dropped the book. I hadn't arrived 8 days ago, at least not for the first time. I had been here before, somehow. The room seemed to tilt around me. Outside, movement surrounded the building now. Not just in the field, at the windows, near the walls, circling, waiting. Then a soft knock came from the front door. 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. The exact same pattern from the wall behind my apartment. Neither of us moved. Another knock followed, then another, patient, polite, almost friendly, as if whatever stood outside believed we would eventually let it in. Daniel closed his eyes. For a second, he looked exhausted. Then he handed me a key, an old brass key. Room 17. The room resets everything. I stared at him. What? It makes people forget. The knocks continued, slow, steady. The clock ticked toward 3:37. Daniel took a deep breath, then looked directly at me. The reason I keep coming back, another knock, is because every time somebody opens the window, another knock. The cycle starts again. My grip tightened around the key. The footsteps outside stopped. Every single one. The silence that followed felt wrong. Not empty, expectant, like the entire property was holding its breath. Then something scratched slowly across the front door. Wood splintered. Metal groaned. Daniel didn't look away. His voice dropped to a whisper. And for the first time all night, he sounded completely certain. It's here. The scratching stopped. A shadow appeared beneath the gap under the door, long, thin, impossible. And then the doorknob began turning. Slowly, deliberately, the metal clicked once, then again. The filing cabinet trembled as pressure pushed against the door from the other side. Neither Daniel nor I moved. The shadow beneath the door stretched farther into the room, longer than it should have. Almost reaching the front desk, the air felt impossibly cold. My breath hung in front of my face. The old clock above the counter ticked toward 3:38 a.m. Daniel suddenly grabbed my arm. Now! Before I could react, he shoved the room 17 key into my hand. Then he sprinted toward the rear hallway. Not away from the danger, toward it. For a second, I stood frozen. Then another violent impact hit the front door. Wood cracked. The filing cabinet slid several inches backward. The shadow beneath the door twitched, as if something outside had become excited. Matthew! Daniel's voice echoed from the hallway. Now! I ran. The office disappeared behind me. The hallway, my apartment, the back exit. Everything blurred together. Then I was outside. Cold wind, moonlight, the motel, room 17, the door already standing open. Behind me came a crash, the office door finally giving way. I didn't look back. I ran directly toward room 17. Every instinct screamed that I was making a terrible mistake. Yet somewhere deep inside me, fragments of memory were returning. The notebook, Harold, the woman, the warnings, the cycles. This had happened before, not exactly like this, but close enough. I reached the room. Daniel stood inside, waiting. The broken window gaped open behind him, dark pasture beyond, nothing visible, nothing at all, which somehow felt worse. Daniel looked exhausted, like a man carrying a burden for far too long. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, not frightened, not forced, relieved. I remember now. The words hit me strangely. What? He looked toward the open window, then back at me. It was never trying to get in. My stomach dropped. The footsteps outside stopped completely. Every sound vanished. Daniel continued. We kept asking the wrong question. The room suddenly felt very small. The darkness beyond the shattered window seemed endless. Then Daniel whispered the sentence that finally made everything fit together. It was trying to keep something from getting out. A memory exploded back into place, not a fragment. Everything. 3 months earlier, me, room 17, the window, the voice calling my name, my hand opening the frame, and something standing on the other side, not entering, leaving. I staggered backward. The realization hit like a physical blow. The thing in the field, the voices, the copies, the missing memories. They hadn't come from outside, they had come from here, from room 17, from whatever existed beyond that window. Daniel saw the understanding on my face. Then he nodded. Now you remember. A shape appeared beyond the broken frame, not walking, not running, simply standing there, watching, far larger than any human should be, its outline impossible to hold in focus. My head immediately began to ache. Daniel stepped toward the window, toward the darkness, toward the thing. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded calm, peaceful. The same thing Harold did. The thing beyond the window remained motionless, waiting. Daniel placed one hand on the frame, then looked back at me one final time. "If you remember tomorrow," his smile faded slightly, "burn the room." The motel lights suddenly returned, every bulb, every sign, every lamp. The room filled with light. I blinked, just for a second, only a second, and when my vision cleared, Daniel was gone. The broken window was gone. The room looked normal, completely normal. Bed, lamp, dresser, nothing else. No shattered glass, no open field, no impossible figure, nothing. I stood alone in room 17, the morning sun shining through the curtains, birds singing outside, as though the night had never happened. The register later showed only one guest, me. No Daniel Voss, no strange entries, no evidence, nothing. I quit that afternoon, loaded my car, left without speaking to Harold. The motel disappeared in my rearview mirror. I never went back, at least that's what I told myself, because 6 months later, while cleaning out an old jacket pocket, I found something that should not have existed, an old brass room key, room 17, and attached to it was a small paper tag, written in my own handwriting. 3 words I still don't remember writing. "See you again." There are a lot of things from that job that I've forgotten. People I talked to, license plates, weather, entire weeks, honestly. When you work enough overnight shifts, especially in a place where almost nothing happens, the nights start blending together. But there was one night I never forgot, and the weird thing is, nothing actually happened at first. No screaming, no strange creature, no guy running through the parking lot, nothing like that. It started with a man sitting at a picnic table. That's it. Just a man sitting alone. If you'd walked past him, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. I almost didn't. This happened back in January of 2021 when I was working nights at a highway rest stop off Interstate 80 in Wyoming. And if you've never been through that part of Wyoming after midnight, it's hard to explain how empty it feels. During the day, it's beautiful. At night, especially in winter, it feels like the edge of the world. You get long stretches where you don't see another vehicle. No houses, no businesses, nothing, just darkness and open land. The rest stop itself wasn't much. A parking area, a small building with restrooms, vending machines, a maintenance room, a few picnic tables outside. Most nights were boring enough that I'd spend time making coffee I didn't even want just to have something to do. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that night. Around 12:40, a pickup truck pulled into the lot. Nothing fancy, older truck, faded blue paint. The driver parked near the far picnic area and got out. Older guy, gray beard, brown jacket. Looked like somebody who'd spent a lot of time driving. I remember seeing him through the office window, then immediately forgetting about him, because there was nothing memorable about him, at least not yet. About 45 minutes later, I happened to look outside again. He was still there. Same table, same position, looking out toward the prairie. Now, honestly, even that wasn't enough to get my attention. People stop during long drives. Some call family. Some eat. Some just sit. I figured he was doing one of those things. The part that got my attention happened a little later. There was a truck driver who stopped there pretty regularly. His name was Rick. Nice guy. Probably in his 60s, always bought coffee, always complained about weather forecasts. That night, he came inside, grabbed a cup, and then stopped near the front window. He looked outside, then looked at me, then looked outside again. I remember him asking, "That guy's still sitting there?" I laughed and said, "Yeah." Then Rick got this strange look on his face, not scared, confused, like he was trying to remember something. I asked what was wrong. He didn't answer right away. He kept staring through the glass. Then he said, "Maybe I'm mixing him up with somebody else." I asked him what he meant, and this is where things started getting weird. Rick pointed toward the picnic table. The man hadn't moved, not once, just sitting there looking west. Then Rick said, "I drove past here earlier tonight." I nodded. He drove that route all the time, nothing unusual about that. But then he added, "Actually, I drove past twice." He took a sip of coffee, still watching the man outside. Then he said something that made me stop what I was doing. I could have sworn he was sitting there both times. I remember kind of smiling because the obvious explanation was that he was mistaken. People remember things wrong, especially after driving for hours. But Rick didn't sound uncertain. That's what bothered me. He sounded like somebody trying very hard to convince himself he was mistaken. The man outside still hadn't moved. The parking lot was quiet. The wind was pushing little trails of snow across the pavement. Everything looked normal. Then the phone rang. One of the old landline phones behind the counter. I picked it up. And before I could even say hello, a woman asked me a question. Not directions, not road conditions, not whether the restrooms were open. Her first question was, "Is he still looking west?" I remember blinking, just staring at the receiver for a second, because I hadn't told her there was anybody outside. And before I could answer, she said something else, something that didn't make any sense at all. She said, "Don't let him turn around." And then the line went dead. I remember holding the receiver against my ear for a second longer than I needed to. Not because I thought she'd come back. I was just trying to figure out whether I'd misunderstood what she said. "Don't let him turn around." That was the exact phrase. No explanation, no context, nothing. Just those 5 words. Then silence. I put the phone down and looked outside. The man was exactly where he'd been before. Same table, same position, same direction, looking west. At this point, I wasn't scared. Honestly, I was more annoyed than anything. I assumed somebody was messing around. Maybe somebody who knew the rest stop. Maybe somebody who knew the guy outside. Who knows? Weird calls weren't exactly common, but they weren't impossible either. Rick was still standing near the coffee machine. I asked him, "You know that guy?" He looked through the window again, then shook his head. "No." The answer came immediately, too immediately, like he'd already been thinking about it. Then he said something that caught me off guard. I thought I did. I frowned. What does that mean? Rick didn't answer right away. He kept watching the man outside. The guy still hadn't moved, not even a little. Then Rick finally shrugged. "I don't know." He laughed a little. The kind of laugh people do when they're uncomfortable. "Maybe I'm just tired." A minute later, he left, got back in his truck, pulled out of the parking lot, and that should have been the end of it. Honestly, if the phone hadn't rung, I probably would have forgotten the whole thing. But after that call, I found myself looking outside every few minutes, not intentionally, just checking. The man was always there, every single time. At one point, I actually started paying attention to the clock. 1:57, still there. 2:06, still there. 2:14, still there. Same position, same direction. Now here's the part I didn't realize until later. I never saw him move. And I don't mean he wasn't walking around. I mean literally every time I looked outside, he was in the exact same posture. Same shoulders, same head position, same arms. Like somebody had taken a photograph and taped it to the window. That probably sounds stupid, but that's honestly what it felt like. The longer I watched him, the more unusual it seemed. Not because people can't sit still, because eventually everybody shifts. You scratch your face, move your leg, check your phone, something. This guy wasn't doing anything. 2:20, I decided I was being ridiculous. The guy was probably exhausted. Maybe he'd gotten bad news. Maybe he was waiting for somebody. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. So I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately. Wyoming winters don't mess around. The air felt sharp enough to hurt your lungs. The parking lot was empty except for a few trucks parked near the far side. The man was maybe 70 or 80 feet away, still sitting there. I started walking toward him, and as I got closer, something else struck me. There wasn't anything in front of him, no vehicle, no person, no building, nothing. Just miles of dark prairie stretching toward the horizon. I slowed down, not because I was nervous, because suddenly I wasn't sure how to start the conversation. What do you even say? Hey, are you okay? Hey, why are you sitting here? It felt awkward. By the time I reached the table, I was already regretting walking over there. The man didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, nothing. He just kept staring west. I stopped a few feet away. Everything okay? No response. Not even a glance. I remember thinking maybe he hadn't heard me. The wind was pretty strong, so I spoke a little louder. Sir? Nothing. Now it was getting strange. I took another step closer, and that's when I noticed something. The guy wasn't staring into the distance. Not really. His eyes seemed focused on something specific, something out there, far away. I followed his line of sight. At first, I didn't see anything. Just darkness, snow, grass. Then I noticed a light, tiny, almost impossible to see. A single white light sitting somewhere out in the prairie. It looked incredibly far away, maybe a farmhouse, maybe a vehicle, I wasn't sure. I looked back at the man, then back at the light, then back at the man again, and for the first time all night he spoke, quietly, almost like he was talking to himself. He moved. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I looked back toward the prairie. The light was still there, exactly where I'd seen it. Nothing looked different. I looked at the man again. What moved? For the first time since arriving, he turned his head slightly, not toward me, just enough that I could see part of his face. And what he said next was so unexpected that I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I genuinely thought he was joking. He said, "That's not where he was standing an hour ago." I remember laughing, not because it was funny, because I honestly thought he was messing with me. There was a tiny light way out in the prairie. That was all I saw, one little white dot sitting somewhere in the darkness. I looked back toward him and said, "What do you mean, standing?" The man didn't answer immediately. He kept staring toward the light. Then he shook his head slightly, almost like he'd forgotten I was there, or maybe regretted saying anything. I stood there for another few seconds, waiting. Finally, he said, "You work here?" I nodded. "Night shift." He didn't look at me, just kept watching that light. Then he asked, "How long?" The question felt strange. Not because of what he asked, because of how serious he sounded. "About a year." The man nodded slowly. Then he said something that made even less sense. "Long enough to know what belongs out here." I remember looking around. Nothing was out there except open land. At least that's how it looked. I followed his gaze again. The light was still there, tiny, motionless. Honestly, I was starting to feel stupid standing in the cold having this conversation. The whole thing felt ridiculous. I finally asked him directly, "What exactly are you looking at?" For the first time, he turned enough for me to see his face properly. His expression wasn't frightened. It wasn't excited. It was tired, like somebody who hadn't slept in days. Then he pointed toward the horizon, toward the light, and said, "Just watch it for a minute." I don't know why I listened. Maybe because I was curious, maybe because it was 2 in the morning and I had nothing better to do. Whatever the reason, I stood there watching that tiny white light. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Nothing happened. I was about to tell him I needed to get back inside. Then I saw it. The light moved. Not far, just enough that I noticed. Maybe a few feet, maybe less. I frowned. At first, I assumed it was a vehicle. That would have explained everything. Except vehicles don't usually move sideways without changing brightness. This one did. The light simply shifted to the right, stopped, then stayed perfectly still again. The man beside me never reacted, almost like he'd expected it. I kept staring. trying to figure out what I was actually seeing. Another 20 seconds passed, then it moved again, a little farther this time. Same direction, same slow movement. Then it stopped. My first thought was that somebody was walking out there with a flashlight. But the more I watched it, the less sense that made. The terrain wasn't flat. There were fences, ditches, snowdrifts. Nobody would be casually walking around miles from the highway in the middle of January. And if they were, why hadn't I seen the beam moving? Only the light itself seemed visible. The man finally spoke again, quietly, almost like he was continuing a conversation we'd already been having. It started 3 nights ago. I looked at him. What did? He nodded toward the horizon, the light. That answer didn't help much. I asked him what he meant, and for the first time, he actually looked nervous, not scared, nervous. The kind of nervous you get when you're about to tell somebody something that sounds crazy. Then he said, "Every night it gets a little closer." I didn't know what to say to that. Partly because it sounded ridiculous, partly because some small part of me had already started wondering whether he was right. The light had definitely moved. I'd seen it myself. The question was why. The man looked back toward the prairie. Then he asked me something, a question I still think about sometimes. He said, "Do you know why people get uncomfortable out here?" I shrugged. "Because it's isolated?" He nodded. "That's what most people think." Then he pointed toward the darkness, the endless darkness beyond the rest stop, the miles and miles of open land, and he said, "No." His voice was almost a whisper now. People get uncomfortable because there's nowhere for anything to hide. I remember staring at him, trying to understand what he meant, and then I looked back toward the horizon, toward the light. And that's when my stomach suddenly tightened, because the light wasn't there anymore. It hadn't faded, it hadn't moved. It was simply gone. The man noticed immediately. I could tell by the way his shoulders stiffened. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The prairie looked completely empty again. No light, no movement, nothing. Then the man stood up so fast that it genuinely startled me. His chair scraped against the frozen ground. His eyes remained fixed on the darkness. And in a voice that sounded completely different from before, he said, "We need to go inside." The urgency in his voice caught me off guard. I laughed a little, not because I thought it was funny, more because his reaction felt so sudden. "What? Why?" He looked directly at me for the first time. And I'll be honest, the look on his face is probably the reason I'm telling this story today. Because whatever he'd been feeling before, whatever concern he'd had, it was gone. Now he looked genuinely afraid. And before I could ask another question, the phone inside the building started ringing at exactly the same moment. The man looked toward the building, then toward the prairie, then back at me, and very quietly he said, "Don't answer it." The phone inside the building kept ringing, loud, sharp, echoing through the empty parking lot. I remember looking from the man to the building and then back again. At that point, I still wasn't taking any of this seriously. Weird? Sure. Uncomfortable? A little. But I wasn't scared yet, not really. So I asked him the obvious question, why not? The man never took his eyes off the prairie, the darkness, the place where the light had disappeared. Then he said something that immediately made me uneasy, not because of what he said, because of how certain he sounded. Because it isn't for you. The phone rang again. The sound seemed louder now. Maybe because we were standing outside. Maybe because I was actually paying attention. I remember laughing a little, the kind of laugh you make when a conversation starts feeling ridiculous. Then I said, "Who else would it be for?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he started walking toward the building. Fast, not running, but definitely moving with purpose. I followed, mostly because I wanted answers, partly because standing outside suddenly didn't feel as comfortable as it had 10 minutes earlier. The phone was still ringing when we stepped inside. The building felt warmer immediately, brighter too. For a second, everything felt normal again. Fluorescent lights, coffee machines, vending machines humming, the familiar smell of cleaning supplies. I remember feeling relieved, almost embarrassed for letting myself get worked up. The man walked straight past the counter, straight past the phone, like it wasn't even there. The ringing continued. I looked at him, then at the receiver, then back at him. And honestly, curiosity got the better of me. It usually does. That's probably one of my worst qualities. The man noticed me reaching for the phone immediately. Don't. The way he said it made me stop, not because he raised his voice, because it sounded like genuine concern, the kind you hear when somebody sees a child about to touch a hot stove. For a second, I actually considered listening. Then the ringing stopped, just like that. Silence. The man closed his eyes, and I swear it looked like relief, real relief. I remember thinking, okay, that's weird. Then the phone rang again. Both of us jumped. I don't care what anybody says, we both did. The man looked genuinely frustrated now. The ringing continued. One ring, two rings, three. Then something happened that neither of us expected. The second phone started ringing. There were two landlines in the building, one behind the counter, one in the maintenance office. Now both were ringing at exactly the same time. I stared at the hallway leading toward the maintenance room. The man stared too. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked confused. And honestly, that scared me more than anything he'd said. Because until that moment, he'd seemed like somebody who knew exactly what was happening. Now he looked lost. The ringing stopped. Every phone went silent. The building felt strangely quiet. Then a third sound appeared, a faint electronic beep, coming from behind the counter. The security monitor. I turned automatically. The monitor showed 6 camera feeds: parking lot, entrance, truck parking, restrooms, vending area, picnic tables. The same screens I'd looked at hundreds of times. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then I noticed the man standing beside me, or rather, I noticed he wasn't standing beside me, not on one of the screens. I stared for a second, confused, then looked at the actual man, then back at the monitor. The parking lot camera showed him, the entrance camera showed him, the side camera showed him. Every camera showed him, except one. The camera pointed directly at the picnic table where he'd been sitting. The table was empty, completely empty. No man, no chair movement, nothing. Just an empty table sitting in the snow. My first thought was that the camera had frozen. That happens sometimes. I leaned closer. The timestamp was moving normally. Everything else in the frame was moving normally. The snow, the distant truck lights, the shadows, everything. Except the man wasn't there. The same man currently standing 5 feet away from me. I remember blinking several times, like somehow that would help. Then I looked at him, slowly. The man was already staring at the monitor. And the expression on his face immediately told me one thing. This wasn't new to him. He'd seen it before. The realization sent a cold feeling through my stomach, because if he'd seen it before, then whatever was happening tonight wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the first time. The man looked at the empty picnic table on the screen, then quietly said, "That's sooner than last time." I felt every hair on my arm stand up, and before I could ask what he meant, the phone rang again. This time neither of us moved. The ringing continued. Then a woman's voice suddenly came through the building's speakers, not the phone. The speakers, calm, clear, close enough that it sounded like she was standing behind us. And the first thing she said was, "He's finally looking at you." For a second, neither of us moved. The voice had come through the ceiling speakers, the same speakers used for maintenance announcements, weather alerts, emergency broadcasts, nothing else. Certainly not random women in the middle of the night. I slowly looked up. The man beside me did the same. The speakers crackled once, then went silent. The building felt different all of a sudden. It's hard to explain. Nothing had physically changed. The lights were still on, the vending machines were still humming, the coffee maker was still bubbling away behind the counter. But that feeling you get when you're suddenly not comfortable anymore, that's the closest way I can describe it. I looked at the man. "What the hell was that?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still fixed on the monitor, on the empty picnic table. Then he asked me something. "Do you have access to the recordings?" The question caught me off guard. "The cameras?" He nodded. I pointed toward the back office. "We record everything." For the first time all night, he looked interested, not relieved, interested, like he'd just heard something he'd been hoping for. Can you pull up earlier footage? I remember hesitating, mostly because none of this made any sense. Then again, neither did the cameras, or the phone calls, or the voice. So I led him into the back office. The security computer sat against the far wall. Old system, nothing fancy, but it stored footage for about 30 days. I sat down. The man stood behind me, and for some reason that made me uncomfortable. Not because I thought he was dangerous, because I suddenly realized I knew absolutely nothing about him. Not his name, not where he'd come from, nothing. I opened the camera software, pulled up the picnic area feed, then started rewinding. Midnight. The table was there, empty. 12:15. Still empty. 12:30. Still empty. I frowned. The man had arrived around 12:40. At least that's what I remembered. I kept scrolling. 12:35. Empty. 12:40. Empty. 12:45. Empty. I stopped. My stomach tightened. The man was still standing behind me, watching. I backed up slightly, played the footage. Again, same thing. The table remained empty. No truck, no man, nothing. I checked another camera, parking lot entrance, 12:40. The blue pickup truck entered exactly when I remembered. The truck was visible, the headlights were visible, the parking space was visible, everything looked normal. Then the driver door opened, and nobody got out. I remember sitting there completely still. The door opened, the truck sat there. Then the door closed again, as if somebody invisible had stepped out. I played it again. Same result again. Same result. The man behind me finally spoke, quietly. Keep going. I looked at him, then back at the screen. The recording continued. 12:46. The truck remained parked. 12:47. Nothing. 12:48. Nothing. Then something happened. I almost missed it. A shadow appeared beside the picnic table, not walking toward it, not approaching, just suddenly there. One frame empty, next frame, somebody sitting there. I paused immediately. My pulse started hammering. The man leaned forward. Both of us stared at the screen. The image quality wasn't great, but it was good enough. One frame showed an empty table. The next frame showed the man, already seated, already facing west, as if he'd been there the entire time. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Then the man whispered, "Same as before." My mouth went dry. Before. The words stuck in my head before, not the first time, again. The same pattern, the same event, the same man, the same table. I finally turned toward him. "What do you mean, before?" For the first time all night, he looked genuinely exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like somebody carrying something heavy for a long time. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. Because this isn't my first time coming here. The office suddenly felt much smaller. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He looked toward the monitor, toward the empty table, toward the frame showing himself sitting there. Then he said, "I've been trying to stop this for almost 4 years." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me assumed he was crazy. Another part wasn't so sure anymore. The speakers crackled again. Both of us immediately looked up. This time there was no voice, just static. Then a low humming sound, like a microphone had been switched on somewhere. The man went pale. Actually, pale. The kind of pale that happens when somebody sees something they hoped they'd never see again. Then he looked directly at me and said something that made absolutely no sense, at least not then. It does now. He said, "If the cameras start showing 2 of me," he stopped, swallowed, then finished the sentence. "Don't let either one inside." And at that exact moment, something moved outside the office window, not near the picnic tables, not near the parking lot, much closer. Close enough that whatever it was briefly blocked the light coming through the glass, as though someone had just walked past the window. The problem was, The office window faced a fenced maintenance yard, and there was nobody supposed to be out there. Both of us saw it. That's important, because for a long time I tried convincing myself I imagined certain parts of that night. This wasn't one of them. The man saw it too. I know he did because he immediately turned toward the window. So did I. For a second, neither of us moved. The maintenance yard outside was lit by a single floodlight mounted on the building. Old chain link fence, storage shed, snow, nothing else. It looked completely empty. The man walked over first. I followed. The closer we got to the glass, the more normal everything looked. No footprints, no movement, nothing. I remember feeling a little relieved. Then the man stopped. Look. He pointed toward the snow, near the fence. At first I didn't see what he meant, and then my eyes adjusted. There were footprints, a single trail leading across the yard. The strange thing was where they started, not outside the fence, inside it. The first footprint appeared roughly 15 feet from the building, as if somebody had simply appeared there. No tracks leading into the yard, no gate opening, no fence damage, just a trail beginning in the middle of untouched snow, then continuing toward the building, toward the office, toward us. I felt my stomach tighten. The man didn't say anything, he just kept staring. Then he asked, "Do you have another way out of this room?" I looked at him. What? A back door. I pointed toward the hallway. Maintenance exit. He nodded slowly, then looked back at the tracks. The trail ended directly beneath the office window, the exact window we were standing beside. I remember staring down at the final footprint, trying to understand what I was looking at. The snow around it was untouched. Perfect. No sign the person had walked away, no sign they'd continued moving, just a final footprint and then nothing. Like somebody had taken one last step and disappeared. The man suddenly backed away from the glass, fast, not running, but close. That got my attention immediately. What? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me, and for the first time all night, he asked my name. I told him. He nodded, then repeated it, quietly, almost like he was making sure he remembered. Matthew? I frowned. Yeah. The man looked genuinely nervous now. More nervous than when the phone rang, more nervous than when the speaker came on. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. Has anybody called you by name tonight? The question felt strange enough that I didn't answer immediately. Then I remembered the woman, the phone call, except she hadn't used my name. Neither had Rick. Neither had anyone else. I shook my head. No. The man looked relieved, only for a second. Then the speaker crackled again. Both of us froze. Static filled the office. A few seconds passed. Then a voice came through. My voice, exactly my voice. Not similar, not close, mine, same tone, same pace, same accent, everything. The voice said, yeah. My blood went cold, because it had repeated the exact answer I'd just given, the exact word, the exact way I'd said it. The office fell silent again. I looked at the speaker, then at the man, then back at the speaker. Nobody spoke. Then my voice came through again, this time from somewhere outside, not the speaker. Outside the building, near the maintenance yard. Yeah, exactly the same. I felt every hair on my arm stand up. The man closed his eyes, just for a second, like somebody receiving confirmation of something they'd been afraid of. Then he said quietly, okay. I stared at him. Okay, what? He looked at me. And I'll never forget the expression on his face, not because he looked scared, because he looked disappointed. Like somebody who had spent years hoping he was wrong. Then he said, it's interested in you now. For a moment, I genuinely thought he was insane. Interested? What did that even mean? I opened my mouth to ask, then stopped. Because through the office window, beyond the maintenance fence, I noticed something. Someone. Standing near the edge of the floodlight, far enough away that details were hard to make out. Close enough that I knew it was a person, or at least something shaped like one. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the building, watching us. I immediately pointed. The man looked, and the second he saw it, all the color drained from his face. Not fear, recognition, like he'd just seen somebody he already knew. Then he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. No. I looked at him, then back toward the figure. The floodlight flickered once, twice. The figure remained motionless. Then the light stabilized, and I finally got a clear look at whoever was standing out there. The person wasn't the older man, wasn't Rick, wasn't anyone I'd seen that night. It was me, standing perfectly still beyond the fence, looking directly into the office window and smiling. For a second, my brain completely refused to process what I was looking at. The shape beyond the fence looked exactly like me. Not similar, not close. Exactly. Same height, same jacket, same face. Even the way it was standing felt familiar. The floodlight above the maintenance yard buzzed softly. The figure never moved, never blinked, just stood there smiling. And the smile was wrong, not exaggerated, not monstrous, just slightly off. The kind of smile somebody makes when they know something you don't. I remember turning toward the older man, mostly because I wanted him to tell me I was imagining it, or explain it, or do something, anything. Instead, he looked absolutely defeated, like he'd just watched the worst possible outcome happen. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then the figure outside lifted one hand, slowly, and waved. My stomach dropped, not because it waved exactly the way I would. Same motion, same timing, same awkward little movement at the end. The kind of thing nobody notices about themselves until they see it. The man beside me immediately grabbed my arm, hard. "Don't wave back." I stared at him. "What?" "Don't wave back." The urgency in his voice caught me off guard. I wasn't planning to wave. The thought hadn't even crossed my mind, but the fact that he'd said it made the situation feel 10 times worse. The figure remained standing there, smiling, waiting. Then it lowered its hand. The office felt completely silent. Even the vending machine seemed quieter. The man finally spoke. "Has it copied your voice before tonight?" I shook my head. "No." He nodded, not because that was good news, because it confirmed something. Then he asked, "Has it used your name?" Again, I shook my head. The man looked relieved, only slightly. Then he said, "Good." I immediately asked the obvious question, "What is that?" The answer took longer than I expected, not because he didn't know, because it looked like he was deciding how much to tell me. Finally, he said, "I don't think anybody knows." That wasn't the answer I wanted, and he could tell. So he continued. 4 years ago, I thought it was a person. His eyes remained fixed on the figure outside. Then I thought it was somebody following me. The smile outside never changed. The figure simply stood there watching. The man swallowed. Then I thought maybe I was losing my mind. I didn't say anything. At that point, I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. Then he added something that immediately got my attention. It always starts the same way. The figure outside took a single step closer. Not much, maybe a foot, maybe less. But both of us noticed. The man went quiet. I looked at him, then back at the figure, then back at him again. "What starts?" The answer came softly, almost like he was talking to himself. "The copies." A chill ran through me. The floodlight flickered once. The figure didn't move. Then something happened that made every muscle in my body lock up. The office phone rang, and the figure outside reached into its pocket. At the exact same moment, the phone continued ringing. The figure outside slowly pulled something out. A cell phone, my cell phone. At least it looked exactly like mine. Same case, same color, same cracked corner near the charging port. I felt my stomach turn. The figure looked down at the phone, then looked back at me, still smiling. The office phone continued ringing. One ring, two, three. Then the figure outside lifted its phone to its ear, and at the exact same moment, the office phone stopped ringing. Silence filled the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then my own voice came from the office phone speaker, calm, clear, exactly like me. "Hey." The older man immediately backed away from the desk, faster than I'd seen him move all night. The voice continued, "Don't listen to him." I stared at the phone, frozen. The voice sounded completely normal, comfortable, like I was talking to a friend. Then it laughed. My laugh. Exactly my laugh. And suddenly I understood something that made the situation far worse. The voice wasn't trying to scare me, it wasn't threatening me. It was trying to sound familiar, trustworthy, like it already knew me. The voice became quiet again, almost conversational. "He's been lying to you all night." The older man's face went pale. The figure outside never stopped smiling, and then the voice on the phone said something that made the room feel 20 degrees colder. It said, "Ask him what happened to Rick." The office went completely silent. For a second, nobody moved. The phone sat on the counter. The figure stood outside the fence. The older man stood beside me. And suddenly, I didn't know who I was supposed to trust. The voice on the phone sounded like me. But that wasn't the part that bothered me. The part that bothered me was how calm it sounded. Not threatening, not angry, just patient, like somebody waiting for me to catch up. I slowly looked toward the older man. His expression immediately changed, just slightly, but enough. Enough that I noticed. The phone speaker crackled softly, then my own voice said, "Go ahead." The older man looked away. That was the first time all night he'd done that. Until now, he'd been watching everything, the prairie, the cameras, the figure. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. And that scared me. Because people can fake confidence. They can fake certainty. What they usually can't fake is surprise. And for the first time all night, he looked surprised. I swallowed, then asked the question, "What happened to Rick?" The older man closed his eyes, just for a second, then opened them again. The answer didn't come immediately. Outside, the figure beyond the fence continued watching us, still smiling, still waiting. Finally, the man spoke quietly. "Rick isn't dead." The phone laughed, my laugh, again. The sound echoed through the office. The older man immediately flinched. I noticed. The phone noticed too, because my voice came back a moment later. "That's technically true." The older man looked furious now, not at me, at the phone, at the voice, at whatever was using it. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Rick stopped being Rick." The office suddenly felt much colder. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" The answer came from the phone before he could respond. "Ask him why he comes back every year." The older man's jaw tightened, and suddenly I realized something. He wasn't just scared of whatever was outside, he was scared of this conversation, scared of me learning something. The realization sat heavily in my chest, because until now I'd assumed he was the only person who understood what was happening. Now I wasn't so sure. The phone spoke again, calm, patient, almost friendly. "Ask him what his name was before." The words hung in the air. The older man looked genuinely shaken, not frightened, exposed. The kind of expression somebody gets when a secret they've hidden for years suddenly appears in front of them. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he slowly sat down. The movement seemed to age him 10 years. His shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to leave him. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired, completely exhausted. "Because that isn't my real name." The room went silent again. Even the figure outside seemed motionless, waiting, listening. I felt my pulse accelerate. The older man rubbed his face, then looked directly at me, and for the first time all night, he seemed completely honest. No mystery, no warnings, no half answers, just honesty. "My name isn't Thomas." I frowned. Thomas. Until that moment, I hadn't even known his name. The realization felt absurd. I'd spent hours with him and never asked. The older man nodded toward the figure outside. "The first time I saw one of those," he pointed at the smiling copy beyond the fence. "It looked like me, too." A chill moved through my body. The phone stayed silent. The figure stayed silent. Only the older man continued talking. "That was 19 years ago." I stared at him, 19 years. The man looked maybe 60, maybe. Suddenly, I wasn't sure. He continued, I thought it was a prank. Outside, the smiling figure slowly tilted its head, exactly the way I sometimes did when I was confused. The sight made my stomach twist. The older man kept talking. I thought it was somebody following me. His eyes drifted toward the fence, toward the copy. Then his voice became quieter. I thought I could understand it. The phone finally spoke again, only one sentence. One sentence that immediately made the older man stop talking. Tell him where the first rest stop was. The room froze. The older man's face went completely pale, not nervous, not worried, terrified. For the first time all night. Then I realized something. Whatever happened at this rest stop, whatever was happening now, this wasn't where it started. And before I could ask another question, every monitor in the security office suddenly switched off, all 6 screens, at the exact same time. Then one screen flickered back on, just one. The camera pointed at the picnic table. The table was empty, the snow was blowing. Everything looked normal, until a second figure appeared beside the table, then a third, then a fourth, all standing motionless, all facing the building. And every single one of them looked exactly like me. I wish I could tell you I was mistaken, that maybe the image quality was bad, maybe the snow was distorting things, maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but none of that was true. The camera feed was clear, clear enough that I could recognize details, the jacket, the posture, the way they stood. One of them even had its hands in its pockets, exactly the way I usually did when I was nervous. Nobody spoke. Not me, not the older man, not the voice. For several seconds, we just stared at the monitor. Then another figure appeared, and another. The camera wasn't showing them walking into frame. They weren't approaching from the darkness. They simply appeared. One frame, there was nothing. The next frame, there was someone standing there, watching the building, watching us. The older man slowly sat down. I don't think he even realized he was doing it. He looked exhausted. Completely exhausted, like somebody who had just seen a future he'd spent years trying to avoid. The phone crackled. Then my voice came through again, quiet, calm, almost sympathetic. Now you understand. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. The copies never moved, not one of them. They just stood there, facing the building, facing me. Then I noticed something. One of the copies wasn't looking at the office. It was looking somewhere else. I leaned closer. The older man noticed too. The copy seemed to be staring toward the prairie, toward the darkness beyond the rest stop, the exact direction the older man had been watching all night, the exact direction the original light had appeared. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Because suddenly I remembered something. The older man had never been watching the man at the picnic table. He'd been watching whatever the man was watching. The realization hit me hard. I looked toward him. What was out there? The older man didn't answer, not immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the monitor. Then he quietly said, I never found out. The answer surprised me. After everything that had happened, I'd assumed he knew more, a lot more. But he shook his head, slowly, almost sadly. I spent 19 years trying. The phone remained silent, the copies remained motionless. Outside, the wind pushed snow across the parking lot. The rest stop suddenly felt very small. Then the older man pointed toward the monitor. A new figure had appeared. Not another copy. Someone else. A person standing near the edge of the frame. The image quality wasn't great. The distance made it difficult to see details, but I immediately recognized him. Rick, the truck driver. My stomach dropped. Rick stood among the copies, perfectly still, facing the same direction they were, facing the building. The older man's expression darkened. Then he quietly said, That's why he looked familiar. I turned toward him. What? The older man swallowed. His eyes never left the screen. Because I met him before. The room suddenly felt colder. I stared at him. What are you talking about? He looked at me, and the sadness in his face genuinely caught me off guard, because it wasn't fear, it wasn't panic. It was regret, deep regret. Then he said something that made my pulse quicken. I met Rick 7 years ago. The sentence hung in the air. I stared at him. 7 years. That wasn't possible. Rick had been here tonight, buying coffee, talking about weather, acting completely normal. The older man saw the confusion on my face. Then he nodded toward the monitor, toward the motionless figure, toward Rick, and quietly said, "That isn't Rick anymore." The phone immediately crackled. My voice returned. Only one sentence that made every hair on my arm stand up. Because for the first time all night, it sounded amused, almost happy. And it said, "He's finally starting to remember." Before I could ask what that meant, every light in the building went out. The office, the hallway, the vending area, everything. Darkness swallowed the rest stop instantly. The monitors died. The phone went silent. The only light remaining came from outside, moonlight reflecting off the snow. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, somewhere out in the darkness beyond the building, I heard footsteps. Not one set, not two. Dozens, slowly approaching. And they all sounded exactly the same. That's what scared me. Not the number of footsteps, the rhythm. Every step landed at the exact same moment, like 100 people marching perfectly in sync, or one person taking the same step over and over again. The older man heard it too. I could tell immediately because he closed his eyes, not in fear, in recognition, like he'd been expecting this. The darkness inside the office felt heavier somehow. Outside, moonlight reflected off the snow, just enough to make out shapes. The parking lot, the fence, the edge of the prairie, nothing else. The footsteps continued, slow, steady, getting closer. Then they stopped, all at once. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I remember holding my breath without realizing it, waiting, listening. The older man suddenly grabbed my arm, hard. "Whatever happens," his voice was barely above a whisper, "and don't answer if you hear yourself." I stared at him. "What?" But before he could explain, a voice came from outside. My voice, exactly my voice. "Matthew." The sound came from somewhere near the entrance, not shouting, just talking normally, like somebody trying to get a friend's attention. My stomach tightened. The older man's grip on my arm got stronger. The voice came again, closer this time. "Matthew, open the door." Every instinct in my body wanted to hear more, to understand, to figure out what was happening. The older man seemed to know that because he immediately said, "Don't respond." The voice outside laughed softly. My laugh. Exactly my laugh. Then another voice joined it, also mine, then another, then another. Soon there were dozens, every single one sounding exactly like me. Some were whispering, some were talking, some were laughing. All of them just beyond the walls, just beyond the darkness. The sound made my skin crawl because they weren't saying random things. They were having conversations, my conversations, fragments of memories. Things I'd said years ago, arguments, jokes, phone calls, pieces of my life, all repeating outside in the dark. I felt physically sick. The older man looked toward the front entrance, toward whatever was out there. Then he quietly said, "It's building them." My heart hammered. "What?" He swallowed, then finally told me the one thing he'd been hiding all night. The copies aren't the problem. The darkness beyond the office suddenly felt enormous. The voices continued, dozens of versions of me talking over each other. Then the older man pointed toward the prairie, toward the darkness beyond the rest stop, and said, "The thing out there doesn't replace people." He paused. The voices outside abruptly stopped, every single one. The silence returned instantly. The older man's face went pale because he knew what that meant, and a second later, so did I. Something scraped slowly across the front door, then came 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3. The older man's expression changed immediately, not fear, resignation, like a man finally reaching the end of something. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Matthew, I need you to remember something. Another knock came from the door, slower this time, patient, waiting. The older man's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and the next words out of his mouth made my blood run cold, because they weren't new information. Somehow, deep down, they felt familiar, like something I'd forgotten, something I'd heard before. He looked me directly in the eye and said, "You've already survived this once." For a second, I just stared at him. The words didn't make sense, not logically, but something about them hit me in a place I can't really explain, like hearing part of a conversation you forgot you'd had. The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Patient, almost polite. The older man never looked away from me. You don't remember because it doesn't let you. My pulse was pounding so hard I could hear it. Outside, everything remained silent. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Just the thing waiting beyond the door. The older man swallowed, then said, "The first time I met you was 7 years ago." My stomach dropped. What? You were working nights at another rest stop. I felt dizzy. The room suddenly seemed smaller, the darkness thicker. The older man nodded slowly. You were the one who warned me. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the moment he said it, something happened. Not a memory, not exactly. More like a crack. A crack in something I'd forgotten. For the briefest second, I saw another building, another parking lot, another winter night, and somebody sitting across from me saying the exact same thing. Don't answer the door. The image vanished immediately. The older man saw it happen. He knew. You're remembering. The knocking stopped. The silence outside became absolute. Then a voice came through the door. Not mine, not the older man's. Something else, something calm, something ancient. And it said, Matthew. Just my name, nothing else. The older man's face went completely pale because whatever had been copying voices all night, whatever had been using memories, whatever had been making the copies, this was the first time it had spoken with its own voice. And somehow we both knew that meant it was finally here. The doorknob began turning, slowly, deliberately. The older man took a step toward the darkness, toward the door, toward whatever was waiting outside. Then he looked back at me one final time and quietly said, "Now I remember why you survived." The lock clicked, the door began opening, and suddenly I remembered everything. Not all at once, not like in a movie. It came back in pieces, fragments, moments, conversations, faces. The first thing I remembered was another rest stop. Different state, different building, same feeling, same darkness, same voice. Then another memory surfaced. A man sitting across from me, terrified, asking questions I couldn't answer, questions I had asked somebody else years before. Then another memory, and another, until I finally understood what the older man had been trying to tell me all night. This wasn't the first time, not even close. The thing outside wasn't following a person. It was following a pattern, a cycle, a chain, and somehow I had been part of that chain for years without knowing it. The door opened another inch. Cold air drifted into the office. The older man stepped forward, not because he was brave, not because he thought he could stop it, because he finally remembered what he was supposed to do. I remembered too. The realization hit me so hard it almost knocked the breath out of me. The copies, the voices, the memories, none of those were the goal. Those were bait. The thing wanted attention, recognition. It wanted someone to acknowledge it, to respond, to answer, to engage. Every person who became trapped in the cycle had done exactly that. At some point, they responded. At some point, they answered back. At some point, they became curious. The older man looked over his shoulder. For the first time all night, he seemed calm, completely calm. Then he smiled, a real smile. Not frightened, not exhausted, relieved, and quietly said, "You finally remembered." The door opened wider. Something stood beyond it. I never got a clear look. And honestly, I'm glad. People always ask what it looked like. I don't know, even now. My brain refuses to hold on to the image. It's like trying to remember a dream after waking up. The harder you try, the faster it disappears. I only remember one thing. It wasn't looking at the older man, it was looking at me, waiting. The same way it had waited all night, the same way it had waited for years. The older man slowly turned toward it, then said something I'll never forget. Not this time. And he stepped through the doorway. The darkness swallowed him immediately. The door slammed shut. Every light in the building came back on. The monitors flickered to life. The phone stopped ringing. The voices vanished. Everything became normal again, just like that. The office looked exactly the way it had at the beginning of the shift. Coffee machine, counter, security monitors, nothing unusual. The older man was gone. The copies were gone, the footprints were gone. Everything was gone. Except one thing. On the desk, a folded piece of paper. I don't remember walking over to it. I don't remember picking it up. I only remember reading it. One sentence. Written in my own handwriting. Handwriting I didn't remember writing. It said, "Don't stay longer than one night." I quit that job 2 days later, packed my things, moved, and for a long time I convinced myself none of it had happened. That's the truth. I really tried. People can convince themselves of almost anything if enough time passes. For years, I avoided thinking about it, avoided talking about it, avoided driving through Wyoming altogether. Then last winter, something happened. I was stopping for gas in Colorado. Normal day, normal town, normal gas station, nothing unusual. I paid for my coffee, walked back to my car, and noticed a flyer taped beside the entrance. One of those missing person posters people usually walk past without reading. I almost did. Then I saw the photograph, an older man, gray beard, brown jacket, the same man from the rest stop, the same man who told me not to answer the door, the same man who stepped into the darkness. The poster said he disappeared into 19 years ago. No trace ever found, no confirmed sightings, nothing. I stood there for a long time staring at that photograph. Then I looked down, and that's when I noticed something that made me leave immediately, because somebody had written a note at the bottom of the poster, a handwritten note, fresh ink, just 3 words. And I recognized the handwriting instantly, because it was mine. It said, "I remember now."